In this lesson, we'll start the process of applying materials and some textures to various parts of our interior scene. Okay, so at this point I have some rough lighting that I have set up. There's still probably a little bit more lighting work that I would like to do, but at this point we could go ahead and continue doing that. But I, at this point, kind of like to start getting into a little bit of material application before I start to work too heavily on my lights. That way I can start to see just how the light is going to start to play and react with some of the major materials that we have in the scene. Now, as far as the areas that you want to start with, you can really start with anything. As a matter of personal preference, though, I usually like to start with the largest area of my scene, or the area of my scene that takes up the most amount of screen space. In that case, it's going to be this room. So let's go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to start by just taking this room geometry, and I'll hide everything else, or I'll just isolate this geometry. So with the room selected, there we are, so here's my room geometry. I'll just press Alt-Q on my keyboard to get into an isolation mode. That way it'll make it a little bit easier to get in here and work. Just move that off to the side. So let's start with some materials. I'm going to press the M key on my keyboard to open up my material editor, and I'll just right-click, go to Materials, Mental Ray, and Architectural and Design. So I'm going to start with the main wall color. In this case, I want to do sort of a darker gray color. So double-click on my material. I'm going to start by taking the reflectivity all the way down to 0 because I don't want this to be shiny. And let's come in and give this sort of a nice dark gray color. There we are. Maybe add just a teeny tiny little bit of red in that, just to kind of warm that gray up a little bit more. So something along those lines. Keep in mind that we have turned on our gamma correction in one of our earlier lessons. So if you don't have gamma correction enabled, these HSV values that I have here are going to look much, much different for you. So keep in mind that these swatches that we see have the gamma correction taken into account. So whatever I choose here is going to now be almost exactly what we see in the render itself. Now I'm going to start by taking that and just applying that to the room as a whole. Now that's really not the end of the story, because really we don't want the entire room to be gray. We'd probably want the ceiling to be kind of a nice white, and in my case I'd like the floor to be kind of a nice hardwood floor. So make some materials for that. Let's go again, right click, Materials, Mental Ray, Architectural and Design. Double click on that. Once again, bring that reflectivity all the way down. And for the ceiling color, I'll bring this up to pretty close to white. Now, get in here a little bit tighter, so that way I can try to assign these materials. So let's get in here, just right-click. Actually, you may have to go over into the modifier here. There we go. We'll just go to the polygons. And I'll just get rid of this material editor for the moment, just to get it out of the way. So let's grab these polygons that are just up here along the roof. There we are, making sure I don't leave anything behind, but also making sure I get everything that I need. There we are. I've got a couple little polygons there. So that should work. Now with those selected, I can go back to my material editor. Let's take this white material and drop that onto those selected polygons. So those should be now nice and white, although it's a little bit hard to see from this camera angle. Now let's do the same thing for the floor. So once again, grab the polygons and just control-clicking on these. And try to grab these different polygons that make up the floor, because we'll have a separate material for those. There we are. Make sure we don't leave anything behind. That looks like everything. Once again, bring up my material editor. Add a new Mental Ray, Architectural and Design. And for this one, we're going to plug in a bitmap for the color. So we'll double click on that. We're going to connect in this wood floor texture. Again, this is found in your Scene Assets, Images directory. In this case, because we are using gamma correction, we're just going to leave this option of use the image's own gamma. That'll make sure that gamma correction is taken into account and that this texture doesn't undergo any sort of additional brightening or anything like that. So we want to make sure that this is left at its setting. Now, let's take that material and drop it onto these polygons for the floor. Okay, and we can exit out that isolation mode whenever we're ready. Now, getting in here a little bit tighter, let's take this material that we have, this material number 16, and with that selected, we'll go ahead and tell it to view our texture in the viewport. There we are. So obviously, pretty large wood texture that we have there. So we're going to have to come in here and make some adjustments to this. So let's double click on our bitmap and start to increase our tiling. So maybe something like 10 by 20. Looks like that should work pretty well. Now this is probably going to be a very, very highly reflective material. Probably a lot more reflective than what we want. So let's start to make some changes to this. If you want, you can start to use your little preview thumbnail here, although when you start to work with your reflections and things like that, this really doesn't become a tremendous help. You'll really need to rely on your render view. But knowing that this wood floor is sort of a wood type material, its reflectivity is probably going to be a lot less. So we'll bring that down to something like 0.2. It's probably going to have some fairly glossy reflections. It's not going to be a really highly lacquered floor, so want to make sure that the glossiness is set fairly low. The lower the glossiness, the more blurred out our reflections are going to be. And for the reflection, in the section marked BRDF, we're going to set this to IOR, which is a Fresnel reflection. That's actually something that is much more physically accurate. Most things in reality follow this Fresnel reflection law, so I always like to turn that on for almost every circumstance, although there are some small exceptions to that. So let's see what we have. Let's come in and re-render this. There we are, very nice. So now we've got these materials that are assigned to, again, what is probably the most dominant element of my scene, the floor, the wall, and the ceiling. Now this area just above the curtains, we'll give it the same gray material. So we can take this, drop it onto this little section right above the curtains. Now if I take a look at my rendered view here, you'll start to see that we have a lot of noise and a lot of this artifacting that is in these blurry reflections. So we can fix that by starting to dial up our samples. So if I go back to that wood floor material, double click on that, where we have introduced this glossy reflection in here, we can start to introduce a little bit higher number of samples. Keep in mind that as we start to dial these samples up, this is going to slow our renders down. So at this early stage, what I might do is just come in and dial these up just temporarily to see what a good value or what a good number would be, and to make sure that that actually is what I need to do to change this. Now, again, once we start to get into some of these smaller changes like that, this is where I really start to rely very, very heavily on the render region. Very rarely are you going to start to make some changes to your materials that is going to affect your entire scene. So to keep my render time small and to keep things manageable, I'll go ahead and just make it a habit of rendering out just a small region. Now let's come in here. Sometimes this can be a little bit tricky because we are adjusting the camera 001, but right now it's not visible in any of our views, and a lot of times 3ds Max really doesn't like that. So as long as we just make this camera visible, now we can come back and make the adjustments to this region, because you'll notice even when I resized this region, it defaulted back to its original size. So keeping that camera view open whenever you're making those changes should help things out. There we go. So now I'm just going to render this little piece down here, and really, again, I'm just focusing on the samples for these glossy reflections, making sure that they look relatively decent. There we are. So I can maybe just move that over a little bit more and just re-render this little section. Again, everything else out here, not really of much concern to me. Okay, so I can start to see that this is definitely helping, and so it's starting to smooth things out a little bit. This is probably going to be pretty close to the proper settings. Now for my final render, I may need to crank this up even a little bit higher, but for now, at least I know that this is what I would need to do to start making things look a little better. Now, again, at this point, I'm still pretty concerned with my render time. I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time waiting for my renders. So temporarily, I'm going to set that glossy samples back to 8. Now, I might still think that this wood floor is maybe a little bit too reflective or a little bit more reflective than what I might like. So I may even come in and take that glossiness up, down, or a little bit more. So that way it should start to give me some reflections that are even a little bit softer and a little bit more blurred out. Okay, so I think that will work out pretty well. Again, this is not something that we have to get looking absolutely perfect this early on. But as long as we're getting pretty close, if we're 80 to 90% there, then we can always come back and make some of these little minor adjustments a little bit later on when we are a little bit closer to completion and we can afford to sacrifice a little bit more render time. Okay, so now that we have this set up, what we're going to start to do in our next lesson is look at kind of the process of getting just a little bit more visual interest to the lighting of this scene by starting to come in and add some secondary accent lights and things like that. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in our next lesson.